The stagecoach lurched to a stop in front of Fort Kearny's trading post, and Clara Pierce stepped down into the dust with nothing but a worn carpetbag and a heart full of desperate hope. The journey from Philadelphia had taken 3 weeks, and every mile had carried her further from her family's disgrace and closer to a future she could barely imagine. Her father's gambling debts had consumed everything, even her younger sister's chance at schooling, and when Clara had seen the advertisement for mail-order brides heading to Nebraska territory, she had answered it without telling anyone the complete truth. She had written to Mr. Horace Milligan, a shopkeeper who promised security and respectability, but she had never mentioned that she came with absolutely nothing. No dowry, no trousseau, no family connections worth speaking of. Just herself, 22 years old, educated enough to read and write beautifully, and willing to work harder than any woman he might have chosen otherwise. The August heat of 1867 beat down on Fort Kearny with relentless intensity, making the wooden buildings shimmer in the afternoon light. Clara adjusted her bonnet and looked around at the rough frontier town that would become her home. Soldiers from the nearby fort walked the dusty streets alongside trappers, traders, and families heading further west on the Oregon Trail. The place smelled of horses, wood smoke, and possibility. She clutched her letter of introduction and asked a passing woman where she might find Mr. Milligan's general store. The woman, weathered and kind-faced, pointed down the main street. "Third building on the left, miss, but I would not get your hopes too high. Horace Milligan is particular about things, if you understand my meaning." Clara thanked her and walked toward her fate, her worn boots kicking up small clouds of dust with each step. The general store was larger than she had expected, with glass windows displaying everything from farming tools to bolts of calico fabric. She took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and pushed open the door. A bell jangled overhead, and a thin man with spectacles looked up from behind the counter. His eyes traveled over her travel-stained dress and modest appearance with unmistakable assessment. "Mr. Milligan?" Clara asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "I am he," the man replied, setting down his pencil. "And you must be Miss Pierce from Philadelphia. I confess I expected you yesterday." "The stage was delayed by a broken wheel," Clara explained. "I came as quickly as I could." Horace Milligan came around the counter, circling her like a buyer examining merchandise at auction. Clara felt her cheeks burn but held herself still. She had known this moment would be difficult, but the reality of being inspected like a horse up for sale made her stomach turn. "Your letter said your father was a merchant," Milligan said slowly. "What sort of merchant exactly?" Clara's throat tightened. "He imported goods from Europe, fine china, textiles, that sort of thing." "And your dowry?" "Your letter mentioned you would bring household items and some capital to help establish our home together." This was the moment Clara had been dreading since she left Philadelphia. She had exaggerated in her letters, not quite lying but not telling the full truth either. Now, standing in this frontier store with her entire future hanging on her next words, she felt the weight of her deception crushing down on her. "Mr. Milligan, I must be honest with you," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "My father's business failed 6 months ago. Everything was sold to pay his debts. I have no dowry. I have nothing but myself and my willingness to be a good wife to you." The silence that followed was excruciating. Milligan's face darkened from pink to deep red, and his thin lips pressed into an angry line. "You lied to me," he said, his voice cold and sharp as winter ice. "You came all this way under false pretenses." "I exaggerated, yes, but I never meant to deceive you completely," Clara protested. "I can work hard. I can keep house, cook, help in the store. I am educated and healthy, and And penniless, Milligan interrupted. Do you know how many men in this territory would love to have a properly bred wife from the East? Do you know how selective I can afford to be? I need a woman who brings something to this marriage besides a pretty face and empty promises. I need capital, Miss Pierce. I need someone who can help me expand my business, not drain my resources. Tears stung Clara's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Please, Mr. Milligan. I have nowhere else to go. I used my last money to come here. If you send me away, I will have nothing. That, Miss Pierce, is not my concern, Milligan said flatly. You deceived me, and I will not be made a fool. There is a boarding house 2 streets over. Mrs. Henderson takes in laundry and sometimes needs help. Perhaps you can work for your keep until you earn enough to go back east where you belong. Good day. He turned his back on her dismissively, returning to his ledgers as though she had ceased to exist. Clara stood frozen for a long moment, unable to believe this was truly happening. Then, with what little dignity she could gather, she picked up her carpetbag and walked out into the blazing Nebraska sun. The door closed behind her with a final sounding click, and she stood on the wooden sidewalk feeling more alone than she had ever felt in her entire life. She had no money for the boarding house. She had exactly $3.17 to her name, hardly enough for a week's lodging, let alone passage back to Philadelphia. And what would she return to anyway? Her father had drunk himself into an early grave 2 months after his business collapsed, and her mother had remarried quickly to a man who made it clear that Clara was not welcome in his household. Her younger sister Sarah was living with an aunt in Boston, barely scraping by as a governess. There was no home waiting for her back east, no family to catch her when she fell. Clara walked without direction through Fort Kearny's streets, her mind racing through impossible options. She could seek work as a laundress, a seamstress, maybe a cook in one of the rough establishments that fed the soldiers and travelers. But single women without protection were vulnerable in frontier towns, and she had heard enough stories about what could happen to unattached females in places where men outnumbered women 20-1. She needed more than just work. She needed safety, stability, a place where she could build something resembling a life. She found herself walking toward the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to open prairie. The grassland stretched endlessly toward the horizon, golden and wind swept under the August sky. In the distance, she could see the dark line of trees that marked the Platte River's course. The landscape was so different from Philadelphia's crowded streets and brick buildings, so vast and indifferent to human hopes and fears. Clara sat down on a fallen log and finally let the tears come, hot and angry and frightened all at once. She cried until she had no tears left, then wiped her face with her sleeve and tried to think practically. Mrs. Henderson's boarding house was her best option, even if she could only afford a few days. She would find work somehow, doing anything that paid honestly. She had not come all this way to give up at the first obstacle, no matter how insurmountable it seemed. As she stood to return to town, she heard the sound of a wagon approaching from the north. Clara looked up to see a large freight wagon pulled by 4 sturdy mules, loaded high with furs and supplies. The man driving it was unlike anyone she had ever seen before. He was enormous, well over 6 feet tall with shoulders that seemed broad enough to carry the world. His hair was dark brown and hung past his collar, and his face was covered with a full beard that gave him a wild, untamed appearance. He wore buckskin clothing and a wide-brimmed hat, and his eyes, as he drew closer, were a startling shade of blue-gray like storm clouds over mountains. The mountain man pulled his wagon to a stop near where Clara stood, and those piercing eyes studied her with interest. "You look lost, miss," he said, his voice deep and surprisingly gentle. "This is not the safest place for a lady alone." Clara straightened her shoulders, trying to look less desperate than she felt. "I am not lost, sir, merely resting before returning to town." "Resting with tears on your face and no escort." The man swung down from his wagon with easy grace despite his size. Up close, he was even more imposing, but something in his expression was kind rather than threatening. "My name is Isaac Thornton. I trap up in the mountains during winter and come down to Fort Kearny to trade my furs each summer. Been doing it for 8 years now." "And you are Clara Pierce," she replied, then added because there seemed no point in hiding it, "from Philadelphia. Recently arrived and recently disappointed." Isaac nodded slowly, understanding passing across his craggy features. Mail-order bride situation gone wrong. The perceptiveness of his guess made Clara flush. "Is it that obvious?" "This is the 3rd summer I have seen young women step off the stage full of hope and step back on full of heartbreak," Isaac said matter-of-factly. "Eastern men advertise for wives like they are ordering equipment from a catalog, then act surprised when a real human being shows up instead of their fantasy." What did he object to? "Your looks, your age, your accent." "My lack of dowry," Clara admitted, surprised by how easy it was to tell this stranger the truth. "I may have exaggerated my financial circumstances in my letters. When Mr. Milligan learned I came with nothing, he turned me away." Isaac's expression darkened. "Horace Milligan is a small-minded fool who would not recognize true value if it bit him on his bony backside. Begging your pardon for the crude language, miss." Despite everything, Clara found herself almost wanting to smile. No apology necessary. "I think my opinion of Mr. Milligan runs along similar lines." "What will you do now?" Isaac asked. "Do you have funds for return passage?" "No," Clara admitted. "I have about $3 to my name and no prospects. I thought I would try the boarding house, look for work as a laundress or seamstress." Isaac was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with those remarkable eyes. Then he said something that made Clara's heart skip a beat. "I have a different proposal if you are willing to hear it." "What sort of proposal?" Clara asked cautiously. "I have a cabin up in the mountains about 40 miles northwest of here," Isaac began. "Good land, a creek running through it, protected valley where the winters are not as harsh. I built it 5 years ago, thinking I would bring a wife there someday. But mountain men do not often meet marriageable women, and when we do, they generally want nothing to do with the rough life we lead. I come to Fort Kearny every summer hoping to find someone brave enough to share that life, but so far I have had no success." Clara's pulse quickened. "Are you suggesting what I think you are suggesting?" "I am saying that if you need a husband and I need a wife, perhaps we could help each other," Isaac said plainly. "I will not lie to you. The life is hard. The cabin is comfortable but isolated. Winters are long and supplies can run short. You would need to be strong and willing to work alongside me, but you would be safe, fed, and protected. You would have a home and a place where you belong." It was insane. Clara had known this man for all of 5 minutes, and he was offering her marriage. Everything sensible in her Philadelphia upbringing told her to refuse, to find some other way, to not tie herself to a wild mountain man she knew nothing about. But as she looked at Isaac Thornton, she saw something in his eyes that had been entirely absent in Horace Milligan's calculating gaze. She saw honesty, straightforwardness, and a loneliness that matched her own. "You do not know anything about me," Clara said softly. "I could be terrible in every way. I could be lazy or cruel or completely unsuited for frontier life." "Could be," Isaac agreed, "but I do not think so. You have kind eyes and an honest face, even when you are talking about the lies you told." You came all the way from Philadelphia alone, which takes courage. And you sat out here crying instead of going back to town to manipulate some other poor fool into taking you in, which speaks to your character. Sometimes you just know things about people, Miss Pierce, and I know you are someone I could build a life with if you are willing. Clara thought about her options. She could return to Fort Kearny and try to survive alone in a town where she knew no one. Or she could take a chance on this strange, gentle giant who looked at her like she was already precious to him. It was terrifying and completely mad, but something deep inside her whispered that this was right, that this moment standing by the prairie's edge was where her real life was supposed to begin. "I need to tell you something first," Clara said firmly. "I have no dowry. No money, no household goods, nothing of value to bring to a marriage. If you expect a wife who comes with material wealth, you will be just as disappointed as Mr. Milligan." Isaac Thornton looked at her for a long, measuring moment. Then he reached out and gently took her hand in his much larger one. His palm was calloused and rough, the hand of a man who worked hard for everything he had. "Miss Clara Pierce," he said, his voice low and sincere, "you are the treasure I need, not gold or goods or fancy Eastern money. Just you, exactly as you are. If you will have me, I will spend every day of my life making sure you never regret this choice." The words hit Clara like a physical force, making her eyes fill with tears again, but this time they were not tears of despair. No one had ever called her a treasure before. No one had ever looked at her the way Isaac was looking at her now, like she was infinitely valuable just by existing. In that moment, standing in the Nebraska prairie with a mountain man holding her hand, Clara Pierce made the wildest, bravest decision of her life. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I will marry you." Isaac's face transformed with a smile that was like sunrise breaking over mountains. "Then we should find ourselves a preacher before you change your mind. Fort Kearny has a circuit preacher who comes through twice a month. With luck, he is in town today." They returned to the wagon together, and Isaac helped Clara up onto the seat beside him. His hands were steady and strong as they guided her, and she noticed the way he was careful not to hold on longer than necessary, respecting her space even in this moment of beginning. They drove back into Fort Kearny together, and Clara was aware of curious stares from the townspeople who saw her sitting beside the legendary mountain man. She wondered what they thought, whether they judged her for moving so quickly from one potential husband to another. Then she decided she did not care. Let them think what they wished. She was choosing her own path now. The circuit preacher was indeed in town, staying at the boarding house while he performed marriages and baptisms for the local community. Reverend Samuel Morris was a spare, weathered man in his 50s who had been bringing religion to the frontier for 20 years. He looked at Clara and Isaac with shrewd eyes that had seen every variation of human desperation and hope. "You two want to be married?" he asked. "Today?" "Yes, sir," Isaac said. "If it is possible." "It is possible," the Reverend replied, "but I like to speak with couples first, make sure they understand what they are undertaking. Marriage is a sacred covenant, not something to be entered into lightly or for convenience sake." "I understand that, Reverend," Isaac said seriously, "but Miss Pierce and I have both thought carefully about this decision, and we are certain." Reverend Morris looked at Clara. "Miss, you arrived on the stage this morning, did you not? And now, just hours later, you are marrying a man you barely know. Forgive me for being direct, but are you being coerced in any way?" "No," Clara said firmly. "I am making this choice freely. Mr. Thornton has been nothing but kind and honest with me. I know this seems sudden, but sometimes life forces you to make quick decisions. I believe this is the right one." The Reverend studied her face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Very well. I will perform the ceremony. But I want you both to understand that I will not marry anyone who treats this as a temporary arrangement. If I perform this wedding, I expect you both to honor your vows through whatever difficulties come." "I will honor them," Isaac said without hesitation. "So will I," Clara added, and meant it with her whole heart. They were married an hour later in the small church at the edge of Fort Kearny. The building was rough-hewn timber with simple wooden benches, but the light coming through the windows was golden and warm. The wagon driver who had brought Clara to town served as one witness, and Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house served as the other, both of them smiling at the unlikely couple. Clara wore her same travel-stained dress, but Isaac had bought a small bunch of wildflowers from a child selling them in the street and presented them to her like they were the finest hothouse roses. The ceremony was simple and brief. Reverend Morris spoke about the seriousness of the commitment they were making, about faith and trust and building a life together through hardship and joy. Then he asked them to speak their vows. Isaac's voice was steady and sure as he promised to honor and cherish Clara all the days of his life. When Clara spoke her own vows, she felt the truth of the words settling into her bones. This was real. This was happening. She was becoming Mrs. Isaac Thornton, wife of a mountain man, heading into a life she could never have imagined a month ago. When the Reverend pronounced them married and told Isaac he could kiss his bride, there was a moment of hesitation. They had not even kissed before, had barely touched beyond holding hands. But Isaac leaned down slowly, giving Clara time to pull away if she wished, and pressed his lips gently to hers. The kiss was brief and chaste, but Clara felt warmth spread through her entire body from that single point of contact. When they pulled apart, Isaac's eyes held a promise of protection and devotion that made Clara's heart race. They spent that night at the boarding house in separate rooms, a decision Isaac made without Clara needing to ask. "We are married in law and before God," he told her quietly. "But you have had a long, difficult day, and I will not rush you into anything you are not ready for. We have time to learn each other, Clara. All the time in the world." His consideration made Clara want to cry again. She was beginning to realize that Isaac Thornton was the kind of man she had always hoped existed, but never actually expected to meet. He was strong without being cruel, confident without being arrogant, and gentle in ways that had nothing to do with physical weakness. As she lay in her narrow boarding house bed that night, listening to the sounds of Fort Kearny settling into sleep around her, Clara felt something unfamiliar stirring in her chest. It took her a while to recognize it as hope. The next morning, Isaac spent several hours conducting his trading business, selling his furs to the traders who would ship them east and buying supplies for the coming year. Clara watched him work, impressed by his competence and the respect other men showed him. Even the rough trappers and traders treated Isaac Thornton as someone whose word could be trusted absolutely. He introduced Clara as his wife with unmistakable pride, and she found herself standing a little straighter under his approval. When the trading was complete, Isaac took Clara to the general store. Not Milligan's establishment, but a smaller shop run by a German immigrant family. There he bought her practical clothing for mountain life. Sturdy dresses in dark colors that would not show dirt, a warm woolen cloak, boots that would hold up to rough terrain, and under things that made Clara blush when he matter-of-factly added them to the pile. He also bought her a rifle and announced that he would teach her to shoot once they reached the cabin. "I am often out checking my trap lines in winter," Isaac explained. "Sometimes for days at a time. You need to be able to protect yourself and provide food if necessary." "Mountain life is not like Philadelphia, Clara. Everyone has to be capable of doing everything." Clara nodded, both frightened and excited by the prospect. She had never held a gun in her life, never imagined she would need to. But she was determined to prove herself worthy of Isaac's faith in her. They left Fort Kearny the following morning, the wagon loaded with supplies and Clara sitting beside Isaac on the driver's seat. As the town disappeared behind them and the open prairie stretched ahead, Clara felt like she was leaving behind not just a place but an entire version of herself. The girl who had boarded the stage in Philadelphia 3 weeks ago had been desperate and frightened, running from failure with lies on her lips. The woman sitting beside Isaac Thornton was still frightened, but it was a different kind of fear. It was the fear of new beginnings, of possibilities instead of limitations. They traveled northwest, following trails that Isaac knew by heart. He pointed out landmarks as they went, the shape of a distinctive hill, a lightning-struck tree, the ruins of an old trading post. He told her about the land they were passing through, the animals that lived there, the way the seasons transformed the landscape. Clara listened hungrily, trying to absorb everything at once. This was her home now, this vast, wild country that seemed to have no end and no beginning. At night, they camped under the stars. Isaac showed Clara how to build a proper fire, how to arrange their bedrolls for maximum warmth, how to hang their food to keep it safe from animals. He was an excellent teacher, patient and clear in his explanations, never making her feel foolish for not knowing things that were obvious to him. They slept on opposite sides of the fire, maintaining a respectful distance, but Clara found herself watching Isaac in the firelight and wondering what it would be like when that distance closed. On the third day of travel, they left the prairie behind and entered rougher country. The land began to rise, hills giving way to bluffs and then to the foothills of the mountains. Pine trees appeared, first in scattered groves and then in thick forests that smelled of resin and earth. The air grew cooler and thinner, and Clara found herself breathing harder as they climbed elevation. Isaac watched her carefully, making sure she was not struggling too much, but Clara refused to complain. She had chosen this life, and she would prove equal to it. They reached Isaac's valley on the afternoon of the 5th day. Clara saw it first as a break in the dense forest, a place where the trees opened onto a meadow of wild grass dotted with late summer flowers. A creek ran through the center of the valley, its water clear and cold from mountain snowmelt. And on a slight rise overlooking the creek stood a cabin that made Clara catch her breath in wonder. It was not a rough trapper's shack. Isaac had built a real home, a solid log structure with a stone chimney, glass windows that must have cost a fortune to transport, and a covered porch that looked out over the valley. Behind the cabin were a small barn, a smokehouse, and a sturdy corral. The whole place spoke of care and planning, of a man who had been building toward a future he could only imagine. "What do you think?" Isaac asked, and Clara heard nervousness in his voice for the first time since they had met. "I think it is beautiful," Clara said honestly. "I think you have made something wonderful here, Isaac." His relief was visible, and Clara realized how much her opinion mattered to him. This powerful, capable man was actually worried about whether his Philadelphia bride would approve of his mountain home. The realization made her reach over and take his hand, squeezing it gently. Isaac drove the wagon up to the cabin and helped Clara down. Her legs were shaky from days of travel, but excitement gave her strength. Isaac unlocked the cabin door and stood back, letting Clara enter first. The interior was dim after the bright sunlight, but as her eyes adjusted, Clara felt wonder growing in her chest. The cabin was a single large room with a sleeping loft above. The main floor held a stone fireplace, a sturdy table with 4 chairs, shelves lined with supplies, and a cooking area with everything needed to prepare meals. The furniture was handmade but well crafted, showing the same care as the cabin itself. Furs covered the floor, providing warmth and softness underfoot. It was spare but comfortable, practical but not without beauty. It was a home built by someone who understood what mattered. "The loft is where I sleep," Isaac said, pointing to the ladder leading up. "But I can make you a private space down here if you prefer. Hang some blankets for a partition, give you privacy while we adjust to each other." Clara turned to face him, this mountain man who had married her without hesitation and treated her with unfailing respect. "Isaac," she said softly, "we are married. I do not need a partition. I trust you." Something flared in Isaac's storm-gray eyes, something warm and hungry and carefully controlled. "Clara," he said, his voice rough, "you have been through a great deal in a very short time. I do not want you to feel obligated to anything before you are ready. We can take this as slowly as you need." "And if I do not want to take it slowly?" Clara asked, surprised by her own boldness. Isaac crossed the room in 3 long strides, standing close enough that Clara had to tilt her head back to look at him. "Then tell me plainly what you want," he said. "I have been dreaming of having a wife for 5 years, Clara, dreaming of sharing this place and my life with someone. Now you are here, and you are more than I ever imagined. But I need to know you want this too, not just because circumstances forced your hand." Clara reached up and laid her palm against Isaac's bearded cheek. His skin was warm, and she could feel the rapid beat of his pulse in his throat. "I want this," she said clearly. "I want you. Maybe I should be more cautious, maybe I should hold back and protect myself. But when I look at you, Isaac Thornton, I see the man I want to build a life with. I see the man I am already beginning to love." The last word was barely out of her mouth before Isaac was kissing her. Really kissing her this time. Not the chaste press of lips they had shared at their wedding, but a kiss full of passion and promise. His arms came around her, lifting her against his chest, and Clara wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him back with everything in her. She had been kissed before, awkward stolen moments with unsuitable young men in Philadelphia, but nothing had prepared her for this. For the feeling of being wanted so completely, desired so honestly, treasured so openly. Isaac carried her to the ladder and somehow managed to climb it while still holding her, making Clara laugh breathlessly against his mouth. The sleeping loft was dominated by a large bed piled with furs and blankets, and when Isaac laid her down on it, Clara felt like she was sinking into clouds. He stretched out beside her, propping himself on one elbow to look down at her flushed face. "You are so beautiful," he said wonderingly. "When I saw you crying by the prairie, I thought you were the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. And now, knowing you are mine, you are even more so." "I am not beautiful," Clara protested. "My nose is too long and my mouth is too wide and I am too thin." "Your nose is elegant, your mouth is perfect for kissing, and you are exactly right," Isaac countered. "Do not argue with your husband about how beautiful you are, Mrs. Thornton. I am an expert on the subject now." The name, Mrs. Thornton, sent a thrill through Clara. She pulled Isaac down for another kiss, and this time when his hands began to explore, she did not stop him. They undressed each other slowly, shyly at first and then with growing confidence. Isaac was patient and gentle, making sure Clara was comfortable with each new intimacy before proceeding. And when they finally came together as husband and wife in truth, Clara felt a completeness she had never experienced before. This was what it meant to belong to someone and have them belong to you. This was what it meant to be home. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the furs, watching the light fade outside the loft's small window. Isaac traced lazy patterns on Clara's bare shoulder, and she rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Tell me about your family," Isaac said quietly. I want to know everything about you, Clara." So Clara told him about growing up in Philadelphia, about her father's charm and weakness, about watching their comfortable life crumble as his gambling debts mounted. She told him about her mother's swift remarriage and rejection, about her sister Sarah struggling in Boston, about feeling like she had failed everyone who depended on her. Isaac listened without judgment, his arms tightening around her when her voice shook. "You did not fail anyone," he said firmly when she finished. "Your father failed you by not being strong enough to resist his vices. Your mother failed you by choosing a new husband over her daughter. You did the brave thing, Clara. You took your life into your own hands and made the best choice you could. That is not failure. That is courage." Clara felt tears slip down her cheeks, but they were healing tears, releasing old pain. "What about you?" she asked. "How did you become a mountain man?" Isaac's story was different but carried its own sadness. He had grown up in Ohio, the youngest of 6 children in a farming family. When he was 19, a fever had swept through their community, killing his parents and 3 of his siblings in a single brutal month. The surviving children had scattered, unable to maintain the farm without their parents. Isaac had headed west, looking for a place where the past could not find him. He had spent years learning to trap and survive in the mountains, building a new life far from the graves he could not face visiting. "I thought if I came far enough, worked hard enough, I could outrun the grief," Isaac said. "But you cannot outrun those things. You can only learn to carry them differently. This valley, this cabin, they were my way of saying I was ready to live again instead of just surviving. And now you are here, and it feels like everything I went through was leading me to that moment by the prairie when I found you." They talked long into the night, sharing histories and hopes, learning the shapes of each other's souls. When they finally fell asleep, wrapped in each other's arms, Clara felt a peace she had not known since childhood. She was safe. She was wanted. She was loved, or at least on the path to being loved, which felt like the same thing. The next weeks passed in a blur of learning and adjustment. Isaac taught Clara everything she needed to know about mountain life. She learned to shoot the rifle, her arms aching from the recoil until her muscles strengthened. She learned to fish in the creek, to recognize edible plants, to preserve food for the winter. Isaac was patient with her mistakes and lavish with his praise for her successes. Under his teaching, Clara discovered strengths she had never known she possessed. She also learned the rhythms of their small household. She took over the cooking, experimenting with the supplies Isaac had laid in and the game he brought home from hunting. She sewed curtains for the windows from fabric he had bought in Fort Kearny, making the cabin feel more like a home. She tended the small garden plot Isaac had established, coaxing late vegetables from the mountain soil. Every task was harder than it would have been in Philadelphia, but every task also felt more meaningful. She was not maintaining someone else's home. She was building her own. The nights were for each other. Isaac proved to be a passionate but considerate lover, always attentive to Clara's pleasure as well as his own. They made love in the loft bed, before the fireplace, once memorably in the meadow under a blanket of stars that left them both laughing and grass-stained. Clara had been raised to believe that physical intimacy was a duty wives owed their husbands, something to be endured rather than enjoyed. But with Isaac, she discovered it was a joy, a conversation conducted in touches and sighs, a way of knowing and being known that went deeper than words. As summer faded into autumn, the valley transformed around them. The aspen trees turned gold and the meadow grass faded to amber. Isaac began preparing for winter in earnest, checking his trap lines, cutting firewood, making sure every possible crack in the cabin was sealed tight. Clara helped with all of it, her hands growing calloused and strong, her body lean and muscular from constant work. They also talked about the future. Isaac wanted children. He told Clara one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sun set behind the mountains. He wanted to fill the cabin with voices and laughter, to teach his sons and daughters how to live in this wild, beautiful place. Clara felt her heart swell at the thought. She wanted that too, wanted to give Isaac the family he dreamed of, wanted to create something lasting and good out of the chaos that had brought them together. "I hope I can give you children," Clara said softly. "I hope my body is capable of it." "And if it is not, we will still have each other," Isaac replied. "Children would be a blessing, Clara, but you are the essential thing. As long as I have you, I have everything I need." The first snow came in late October, a light dusting that melted by noon but signaled the change of seasons. Isaac grew more serious, more focused, checking and rechecking their supplies and preparations. Clara watched him and understood that winter in the mountains was not a joke. It was a test of endurance and planning, and people who failed that test sometimes did not live to see spring. But Clara was not afraid. She trusted Isaac completely, trusted his knowledge and his strength and his determination to keep them both safe. And she trusted herself now, too, in ways she had not been able to before. She had learned that she was stronger than she had ever imagined, that she could face hardship and uncertainty and come through them intact. The frightened Philadelphia girl who had stepped off the stage in Fort Kearny was gone, replaced by a mountain woman who knew how to survive and thrive in this demanding land. In November, Isaac made a trip down to Fort Kearny for final supplies before the heavy snows made travel impossible. Clara went with him, curious to see the town again and eager to send a letter to her sister Sarah. The journey took 4 days through increasingly cold weather, but Clara found she enjoyed the challenge. She was no longer a passenger sitting helplessly on a wagon seat but an active partner, helping Isaac with the team, setting up camp, contributing her skills to their survival. Fort Kearny had grown even rougher as winter approached, with fewer families and more hard men staying before pushing on or hunkering down for the cold months. Clara noticed the way men looked at her differently now. Before, she had been just another Eastern bride, soft and useless. Now, wearing her practical mountain clothes and moving with new confidence, she was clearly a woman who belonged in this place. She found she liked the difference. They stayed 2 nights at the boarding house, and on the second day, Clara encountered Horace Milligan on the street. The shopkeeper stopped dead when he saw her, his eyes widening in recognition and then in calculation. Clara could almost see him reassessing, wondering if he had made a mistake in rejecting her. "Miss Pierce," he began, then corrected himself. "Mrs. Thornton, I heard you married Isaac Thornton." "How unexpected." "Very unexpected," Clara agreed pleasantly, "but it turned out to be the best decision I ever made." Milligan looked her over, taking in her sturdy clothes and capable bearing. "Perhaps I was too hasty in my judgment before," he said carefully. "If circumstances were different, maybe we could have reached an accommodation." Clara felt Isaac step up beside her, his presence large and protective. "My wife and I need to be going, Milligan," Isaac said, his voice cold. "We have business to attend to." Of course," Milligan said quickly. "I only meant to express my regards." As they walked away, Clara felt Isaac's hand settle protectively on the small of her back. "Did he upset you?" Isaac asked. "Because if he did, I will go back and make it clear that he needs to keep his distance." "He did not upset me," Clara said honestly. "If anything, I feel grateful to him. If he had not rejected me, I never would have met you. I never would have found the life I was meant to live." Isaac stopped walking and pulled Clara into his arms right there on the street, kissing her thoroughly despite the scandalized looks from passing townspeople. "I love you, Clara Thornton," he said against her hair. I think I have loved you since the moment I saw you crying by that log. But now I am completely, utterly, hopelessly in love with you." Clara's heart felt like it might burst from her chest. "I love you too," she whispered. "I love you so much it frightens me sometimes. What if something happens? What if we lose each other?" "Then we will have had this time," Isaac said seriously. "This perfect, precious time when we were together. But nothing is going to happen, Clara. I am going to keep you safe and love you for the next 50 years at least. That is a promise." They returned to the valley laden with supplies and mail, including a letter from Sarah that made Clara cry happy tears. Her sister had found a better position with a kind family in Boston, and was even being courted by a bookstore clerk who sounded wonderfully steady and boring. Sarah wrote that she was happy for Clara, that she hoped her sister had found the security and love she deserved. The letter felt like a benediction, like permission to be happy even though their family had fallen apart. Winter closed in around the valley like a fist. The snows came heavy and frequent, burying the meadow under drifts taller than Clara. The creek froze solid except for one small section that Isaac kept open by breaking the ice daily so they could access fresh water. The world shrank to the cabin and the immediate area around it, and days could pass without seeing anything but white snow and dark trees, and the smoke from their chimney rising into the gray sky. Clara discovered that she did not mind the isolation. She and Isaac created their own world inside the cabin, reading aloud to each other from the books Isaac had collected over the years, playing card games by firelight, talking about everything and nothing. Isaac taught her to play chess, and Clara taught him the parlor songs she had learned as a girl, her voice filling the cabin with melodies that made him smile. They also made love frequently, the cold weather giving them an excuse to stay in bed longer, to press close together for warmth that became something far hotter. In late December, Clara realized her monthly courses had not come. Then January passed with no sign of them either. She waited another week before telling Isaac, wanting to be certain, but the symptoms were unmistakable. She was pregnant with their first child. Isaac's reaction when she told him was everything Clara could have hoped for. He let out a whoop of joy that probably scared every animal within a mile and picked Clara up, spinning her around the cabin despite her laughing protests. Then he became immediately overprotective, insisting she sit down, asking if she felt well, worrying about whether they had enough supplies for a baby. "Isaac, women have been having babies since the beginning of time," Clara reminded him, amused and touched by his concern. "I will be fine. We will be fine." But Isaac was not to be dissuaded from his worry. He read every medical book in his collection, questioned Clara constantly about how she was feeling, and absolutely forbade her from doing any heavy work. Clara bore his fussing with patient amusement, knowing it came from love and excitement rather than any lack of faith in her strength. The winter passed slowly but not unhappily. Clara's body changed as the baby grew inside her, her belly swelling round and tight. She felt the first flutters of movement in February and immediately grabbed Isaac's hand, placing it on her stomach so he could feel their child moving. The expression of wonder on his face made Clara fall in love with him all over again. Spring came late to the mountains, but when it finally arrived, it transformed the valley overnight. The snow melted into rushing streams, wildflowers carpeted the meadow, and the trees burst into green life. Clara stood on the porch one morning in early April, her hands resting on her heavily pregnant belly, and felt overwhelmed with gratitude for the strange path that had brought her to this place. A year ago, she had been desperate and penniless in Fort Kearny. Now she was standing in her own home, carrying her husband's child, looking out at a valley that felt like paradise. Isaac came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her as best he could given her expanded middle. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "How grateful I am," Clara said honestly. "How blessed I feel. How much I love this life we have built together. Even though it is hard, even though we are isolated and you have to work so much harder than you ever did in Philadelphia, especially because of those things," Clara replied. "This life is real, Isaac. It is honest. Everything we have built with our own hands. Every meal, every moment of warmth, every bit of security. We earned it. That means something." "You are extraordinary," Isaac said, kissing the side of her neck. "Do you know that? You are the strongest, bravest, most extraordinary woman I have ever known." Their son was born on a warm night in late May, delivered with Isaac's help after a long labor that tested Clara's strength to its limits. But when Isaac placed the squalling, red-faced infant in her arms, Clara felt a love so fierce and immediate that it almost stopped her heart. The baby had Isaac's dark hair and a loud voice that would serve him well in this big, wild world. "What should we name him?" Isaac asked, his voice rough with emotion as he looked at his wife and son. "I was thinking Thomas," Clara said. "Thomas Thornton, so he will always carry your name proudly." "Thomas Thornton," Isaac repeated, testing the sound. Then he smiled, his eyes bright with tears. "It is perfect." "He is perfect. You are perfect. How did I get so lucky?" "We both got lucky," Clara corrected. "The day we found each other was the luckiest day of both our lives. The next years passed in a blur of growth and change. Thomas thrived in the mountain valley, growing strong and curious and fearless under his parents' watchful eyes. When he was 2, Clara gave birth to a daughter they named Margaret, a quiet, serious baby who studied the world with intense, dark eyes. 2 years after Margaret came another son, David, who was cheerful and easygoing from the day he was born. The cabin expanded to accommodate the growing family. Isaac built an addition that gave the children their own sleeping space and created more room for living. He also improved the barn and corral, adding chickens and eventually a milk cow. The valley became a working homestead, productive and largely self-sufficient. Every year, Isaac made his summer trip to Fort Kearny to trade furs and buy supplies, and sometimes Clara and the children went with him. But increasingly they stayed home, content in their mountain sanctuary. Clara continued to write to Sarah, and eventually her sister came west for a visit, bringing her new husband William and their own 2 children. The families spent a glorious month together, the cousins running wild in the meadow while the adults talked and laughed and marveled at how far they had both come from their desperate Philadelphia days. When Sarah left to return to Boston, Clara cried, but they were good tears. Her sister was happy and safe, and so was she. They had both survived their family's collapse and built new lives. That was all anyone could ask for. As the children grew older, Clara began teaching them reading and arithmetic, using the books Isaac had collected and ordering more whenever he went to Fort Kearny. She was determined that her children would be educated even if they lived in the wilderness. Isaac taught them practical skills: hunting, trapping, tracking, surviving in the mountains. Thomas showed a particular aptitude for woodworking and began helping his father with building projects. Margaret had her mother's love of books and could often be found reading in unlikely places, lost in stories of faraway worlds. David was the family's optimist, finding joy in everything from chores to snowstorms. When Thomas turned 12, a trader coming through the region brought news that made Clara's blood run cold. There had been conflicts between settlers and native tribes in other parts of the territory. Some homesteads had been attacked, and families had fled back to the towns for safety. Isaac listened carefully to the trader's information, asked questions about which tribes were involved and why the conflicts had started, then made his decision. "We are staying," he told Clara that night after the children were asleep. "This is our home. We have good relationships with the Lakota families who hunt in these mountains. We trade fairly, we respect their territory, and they respect ours. I do not believe we are in danger." Clara trusted Isaac's judgment, but she also insisted they take precautions. They made sure the cabin could be secured quickly, that they always had supplies for a siege if it came to that the children knew what to do in an emergency. But the feared attacks never came to their valley. Isaac's assessment had been correct. Their isolation and good relationships protected them from the violence happening elsewhere. The years continued their steady march. The children became young adults, each finding their own path. Thomas married a girl from Fort Kearny and brought her back to the valley, building his own cabin a mile downstream from his parents'. He became a skilled carpenter, making furniture that was sought after throughout the region. Margaret shocked everyone by deciding to become a teacher, moving to a growing town in Colorado where she established a school for frontier children. She visited every summer, full of stories about her students and her adventures. David split his time between the valley and Fort Kearny, becoming a trader like his father, but more interested in the business side than the trapping. Clara watched her children grow and leave and sometimes return, and felt the bittersweet pride of a parent whose job was to raise people capable of living their own lives. She and Isaac had given their children roots in the valley and wings to fly beyond it. That was all they could do. As Clara moved into her 40s and then 50s, her body bore the marks of her hard mountain life. Her hands were permanently rough, her face weathered by sun and wind, her back sometimes aching from decades of heavy work. But she had never felt more beautiful, because when Isaac looked at her, he still saw the treasure he had claimed by the prairie edge all those years ago. His love had never wavered, never diminished. If anything, it had grown deeper and stronger, tempered by time and hardship into something unbreakable. On a summer evening in 1890, 23 years after they had married, Clara and Isaac sat on their porch watching the sun set over the valley. They were grandparents now, Thomas and his wife having produced 3 children who visited often and filled the cabin with chaos and joy. Margaret was engaged to a banker in Colorado, and David was courting a girl in Fort Kearny. The valley looked much as it had when Clara first saw it, unchanged by the years that had transformed everything else. "You ever regret it?" Isaac asked suddenly. "Marrying me on a moment's decision, giving up everything you knew for this life?" Clara looked at her husband, at the silver threading through his dark hair, at the lines around his eyes that came from years of squinting into the sun, at the hands that had held her so many times in love and comfort and passion. "Not for a single second," she said firmly. "You told me I was the treasure you needed, Isaac, but the truth is, we were both treasures. We just needed to find each other to recognize it." Isaac reached over and took her hand, his grip still strong despite his years. "I found you crying by a log with nothing to your name," he said, smiling at the memory. "And you turned out to be the richest thing I ever possessed." "I had no dowry," Clara agreed, "but I had myself, and it turned out that was exactly enough." They sat together in the fading light, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. In the distance, they could hear the creek running through the valley, the same water that had run there when they arrived and would run there long after they were gone. But for now, in this moment, the valley was theirs. The life was theirs. The love was theirs. And it was more than enough. It was everything. the seasons continued their eternal cycle around the valley. Summer with its long golden days and the children's laughter echoing off the mountains. Autumn painting the aspens in shades of fire and gold. Winter wrapping everything in silence and snow. Spring arriving with sudden violence, melting the world back to green life. Through all of it, Clara and Isaac remained constant, the center around which their family orbited. As they moved into their 60s, they began to slow down. The hard work of mountain life took its toll, and they relied more on Thomas and David to help with the heavy tasks. But they were still active, still engaged, still deeply in love with each other and the life they had built. Clara spent more time with her grandchildren, teaching them the same lessons she had taught their parents. Isaac still checked his trap lines, though not as far or as frequently, unwilling to give up the work that had defined so much of his life. One spring morning, Clara woke to find Isaac already up and dressed, preparing to check the trap line that ran along the northern ridge. "Come back for lunch," she told him, kissing him goodbye at the door. "I am making that stew you love." "I will be back," Isaac promised. "Nothing could keep me from your stew, woman." But when the afternoon came and went without Isaac's return, Clara began to worry. Thomas went looking for his father and found him halfway up the ridge, sitting peacefully against a tree overlooking the valley. Isaac had died quickly, the doctor later said, his heart simply giving out after 65 years of hard use. He had been looking at the home he had built, the life he had created when he passed from the world. Clara's grief was profound but not bitter. Isaac had lived the life he wanted, had died in the place he loved, had been spared a long decline. She mourned him with every fiber of her being, but she also celebrated the extraordinary gift of their years together. At his funeral, attended by family and friends from across the territory, Clara spoke about the mountain man who had offered marriage to a desperate stranger and kept every promise he had ever made. "He told me I was the treasure he needed," Clara said, her voice steady despite her tears. And for 23 years, he proved that truth every single day. "We built this life together, this family, this home. And though Isaac is gone, everything he created remains. That is his legacy, and it is the greatest treasure of all." Clara lived another 12 years after Isaac's death, remaining in the valley cabin with help from her children and grandchildren. She saw Margaret marry and have children, saw David settle down with his Fort Kearny sweetheart, saw Thomas's family grow to include 5 grandchildren and eventually 2 great-grandchildren. She wrote her memoirs, the story of a Philadelphia girl who came west with nothing and found everything, and her daughter published them in a book that became surprisingly popular among frontier women. On the morning of her 77th birthday, Clara Pierce Thornton woke in the loft bed she had shared with Isaac for so many years. She felt tired, bone-deep tired in a way that told her the time had come. She called her children to her bedside and spoke to each of them, giving them her blessings and her wisdom, telling them how proud she was of the people they had become. "Tell me again," Thomas asked, his voice breaking. "Tell us the story of how you and Pa met." So Clara told them one last time about the stagecoach arrival, about Horace Milligan's rejection, about sitting by that log crying and certain her life was over. She told them about the mountain man who stopped his wagon and saw something valuable in a penniless bride. She told them about the words that had changed her life forever. "You are the treasure I need." And he was right, Clara finished softly. "I was exactly what he needed, and he was exactly what I needed. We found each other at the perfect moment, and we built something beautiful together. You children, this valley, this family are all the proof anyone could ever need that love does not require dowries or social connections, or anything except 2 people willing to choose each other every single day." Clara Pierce Thornton died peacefully that afternoon, surrounded by her children and grandchildren in the valley that had become her home and her heart. She was buried next to Isaac on the hill overlooking their cabin, and their graves were marked with simple stones that bore their names and dates and a single line chosen by their children. They were each other's greatest treasure. The valley continued its eternal cycles, the creek running clear and cold, the aspens turning gold each autumn, the snow falling silent each winter. But the cabin remained, maintained by Thomas and his children and eventually his grandchildren. It became a landmark in the region, the Thornton homestead, where people came to hear stories about the mountain man and his Philadelphia bride, who had built an entire dynasty out of nothing but courage and love, and the willingness to see treasure where others saw only hardship. And on quiet summer evenings, when the light slanted gold across the meadow and the mountains stood purple against the sky, people swore they could sometimes see two figures on the cabin porch. An enormous man with storm-gray eyes and a slender woman with an elegant profile, sitting close together, holding hands, watching over the valley they had claimed and the family they had created. Whether it was ghosts or memories or simply wishful thinking, no one could say for certain. But the people who saw them always came away feeling hopeful, believing that true love was possible, that treasure could be found in the most unexpected places, and that sometimes the best dowry a person could bring to a marriage was simply themselves, exactly as they were. The story of Clara and Isaac Thornton became legend in that part of Nebraska, told and retold until it took on the qualities of myth. But unlike most myths, this one was true. They had really existed, had really found each other against all odds, had really built a life together that lasted beyond their individual years. Their descendants spread across the West, carrying their blood and their values into new territories and new centuries. And always, when those descendants faced difficult choices or desperate circumstances, they remembered the story of the bride with no dowry and the mountain man who recognized her true value. Because in the end, that was what mattered. Not wealth or social position or the things that seemed so important in the civilized East. What mattered was seeing clearly, choosing bravely, and loving faithfully. Clara and Isaac had done all three, and their reward was a life rich beyond measure, a family that stretched across generations, and a love story that would never be forgotten. The valley kept their secrets and their memories, a living testament to what was possible when two people found each other at exactly the right moment and had the courage to say yes to an unknown future. And every spring, when the snow melted and the wildflowers bloomed, the meadow seemed to celebrate their memory, splashing color across the land they had loved so well. The creek sang its endless song, the mountains stood their eternal watch, and the cabin remained solid and strong, exactly as Isaac had built it all those years ago. It was a home, a shelter, a sanctuary. But most of all, it was proof that sometimes the greatest treasures required no dowry at all.